We've been looking at we're in the very middle of a series called What's a Christian? And it's not about the foundational things of Christianity. It's really about what is a Christian according to the Bible. And what we've discovered pretty quickly is that the Bible doesn't give a real definition of what a Christian is, because the word Christian was only used in the Bible 3 times, and it was used by folks outside of the followers of Christ that were looking in to those following Christ, and they defined them, well, they're Christians. They're following Christ, we'll call them Christians. And we discovered, to our surprise, that it was only used as a derogatory term. If you were called a Christian, it was because you were being criticized. We see 3 times where that's used in the Scripture, and all 3 times it's those Christians, those rotten Christians, those dirty Christians. It's that. And so that kind of explains why anywhere you go in our culture, if you ask somebody, what does it mean to be a Christian, you're going to get different answers. You can be a Christian according to some people and believe that there are many ways to heaven. You can be a Christian and believe that there's reincarnation. You can be a Christian and believe anything in our culture and in even other parts of the world. And that is because the term Christian is not clearly defined in the Scripture. But there's a word we said that Jesus used to define those who followed him, and that word was disciples. Jesus called them disciples. We are afraid of that word because it has in there the word discipline. We don't like the word discipline. That's when we got spanked when we were kids. We got disciplined. So we associate the discipline, being a disciple of Christ, with bad things. But it's not a bad thing. Discipline is a good thing. Without discipline, and this, again, it's almost like I'm not the parent saying, come on, kids, without discipline. I'm saying to you, the truth is, without discipline, you can't accomplish anything in life. On some level, you have to have some kind of discipline. In a home with no discipline, it runs amok. You have kids that are just ruling the roost, and it's not a good thing. It's a scary thing. You know, I remember one time that we were in Nashville, Natalie and I, and we had our kids, and they had these things in Nashville at that time. They were big praise days over the city where churches would all come out, and like 8 to 10, 12,000 Christians would come out from all the different churches, and we would walk the streets with banners. It was cool. And we would meet at a certain place, and there would be bands there, because it's Nashville. They were really big, famous bands, and the churches from all over, probably, I don't know, 75, 150 churches would come together and worship God. It was awesome. We were there with Canaan one time. Canaan was about this big, probably 2.5 years old. And Canaan took off towards the street. We told one of the girls in our youth group wanted to watch him. And we said, she wanted to hold him. We said, you got to really hang on tight because he'll get away from, oh no, I won't let him get away. We looked a few minutes later and he was running towards the street. She had put him down and started talking to a friend. Yeah, I know. Nobody know what happened to her. We buried her in the backyard. Sweet girl. She should have lived a good life. He put her down. She headed for the streets, and I heard my wife in that voice that only a mother can find. You know, the one that would cause the paint to come off the walls. It cause you to know, no, it's that voice. And you know, I heard her say, "Canaan, stop!" And it was that loud, screech of a dramatic. Everyone stopped for miles. People just stopped. It was that scary. And he stopped because she had trained him earlier in his life, that's between 0 and 2.5, that when she gave that voice, he better stop in his tracks. Because how did we say it back in the day? You would jerk a knot in his neck. Is that what we said back in the day? You will know why. It was that moment, and he stopped. And he was this far from a road, and traffic was going up and down that road. He was a little bitty blonde-headed kid. And in that moment, discipline mattered. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Discipline matters in our life, but we don't like the word. Jesus called his followers disciples. And then he said there's this one defining characteristic of being a follower of Christ. One defining characteristic. There are lots that he taught. Now we know, if you read the teachings of Jesus, in fact, one of those who quoted Jesus said, look, we couldn't even put it all in writing. He said, there's so much that he said. But this one thing, Jesus says, this one thing is going to define those who follow me, my followers. And he said it here in 1 John 13, verse 35. And this is from the NIV Bible. It'll be up here. But he said it like this. He said, by this one thing, not many things, he said, by this one thing, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you, what's the word? Love. If you love one another. That's it. In fact, he said, this is more important than anything I've taught. If you don't get anything else right, get this right. It's how you love one another. That's how people are going to know that you belong to me, that you're my followers. That's what's going to define you. It's not how much you know of the Bible. It's not how big your buildings are. It's not how smart you are. It's not how loud you are or pushy you are or rich you are. It is how you love one another. And that's it. That's the defining characteristic. So we talked about that. And then he said this, because we think, well, I can do that. I can love. I love my kids. I love my pets. I love Oreos. I can love. And then Jesus said, but here's how I want you to love. And this is where it gets sticky. This is where it gets difficult for us. This is where the disciples who heard it said, I don't know if we can do that. I want you to love the way I loved you. I want you to love others the way I loved you. And that is not easy. That's huge. Because we look at the way Jesus loved. We look at how he loved people. How he handled people. All kinds of people. And we think, wow. I mean, this is a Savior who hung on a cross and said about those who hung him on the cross, God, please forgive them. Father, forgive them. They don't even know what they're doing. That's how much he loved. And how can we love like that? We love until you mess with us. If you mess with me, I may not love you very well. Oh, I can say, but I do love them, but I'm going to have to hit them now. You know, we've this whole thing of I love you, but I can't stand you, that is not practical in Christianity. We love through our actions. We love the way we treat people. I love you, I just will never speak to you in public. You know what I'm saying? Because you scare me. It's how we treat people. This is it. And here's the thing that this whole message centers around today, and this is I would think, the most difficult message that I will have taught in this series, because it's been difficult for me to wrap my brain around this. There's a tension. There's a tension in the way that Jesus loved. There's a tension. And there's a tension that if we try to explain it, we really can. And if we try to explain it away, if we try to resolve this tension, we can't. There's a tension in the way that Jesus loved. I mean, when Jesus loved, it was often messy. It was messy. And we'll explain that in a minute. It was inconsistent at times, based on our judgment of what justice is and who should be blessed and who shouldn't be blessed and who should be forgiven and who shouldn't be forgiven. Jesus at times seemed to be, to those watching him, inconsistent, messy, unfair at times. You'll see that in a few minutes. Really, really confusing. Because we have one way of looking at things. And Jesus didn't look at it that way. We're going to explain it. So please hear this. You can't try to resolve this tension. If you try to fix it, we've got to do this or this, we can't do both, you're going to miss who Jesus is and why he came and what he did. When you open the scriptures and you take seriously the teachings of Jesus, there is this tension. And at times, he seems to be forgiving some people, but he doesn't forgive others. There are times that he's difficult and hard on some people, and he's very easy on others. There are times that he calls something sin, and there are times he seems to kind of let it go. Why? I've always just thought, well, it's because he's God. Because he can. But the truth is, for an onlooker, for those looking at Christianity from a distance, reading how Jesus treated people, it strikes us as inconsistent. At times, he's kind of harsh towards people. You read that. At times, he's incredibly gentle and kind. At times, he points out specific sins, and at times, he ignores them. And we're all tempted to want to resolve the tension, to try to be one way or the other, to fix it. But if you resolve it, you're going to give something up that's very important. And at the very end of this message, we're going to explain what that means. It's what drove people crazy about Jesus. They didn't understand him. But Jesus was comfortable with the tension. In fact, he ministered through the tension. And we dare not walk away from it, even though it's messy, really, really messy. And at times, people won't understand us as Christians. Well, I don't get you, because people didn't understand Jesus. At times it's confusing, and it leaves people wondering, I don't get this. I mean, it doesn't seem consistent to me. So John, of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, John became an old man eventually. And he had seen so many things. Remember, all of the other followers, all the other disciples had gone the way of the martyr. Many of them, had been killed. Matthew was burned at the stake. That's what was reported back to John. Peter was crucified, some say upside down. Paul was beheaded. All these guys who were followers of Christ were now dead and gone. And many others, the ones you couldn't find them, they were scattered all among the Roman Empire and other places. And John was the only guy left, the eyewitness of all that Jesus did. John was the one. And all those years later, I mean, Jesus would say, I'm going to return. And the people listening thought, well, he's going to return like next Thursday, you know? That he's going to come back really soon. Or at least a month or two, but not a year or two, but not a decade, not a century. They didn't understand what he taught. Paul, now realizing, all right, Jesus is not coming back right away. This isn't going to happen right away, probably not in my lifetime. John begins to write down the experiences that he had with Jesus, the way Jesus loved, the way Jesus did what he did. All Jesus' followers were scattered, and many were martyred, to the best that we can tell, and John survived it all. And he's an old man, maybe 40 or 50 years after the events of Jesus. John writes it down. And it became evident to all these folks that this was what they needed to, this was what they were going to know of Jesus, because they were expecting him to come back any minute. He wasn't. We better read. John writes it down so the generations ahead can hear exactly what happened. What did John witness? So John sits down and he starts writing all the stuff that he personally witnessed surrounding Jesus and all that happened. And he had seen so much, and he begins his account with the life of Jesus. And he paints this big, grand picture of Jesus being like a word. He just pictured Jesus is like a word. And that God sent his word, Jesus, into the world. And that word became flesh. Jesus, the word, became flesh, which is human. And he walked among us, and he ate with us, and he experienced what we experienced. And John paints this beautiful picture, and it's as if Jesus is painting a picture. Listen to this. That thing's already up there. Who put that? Did you put that? I'm just kidding. I see all the eyes go up here. It's just, oh, there it is. Jesus paints this picture, and he paints this picture, and it's a beautiful picture, and it's full of people. It's as if he did, and then he steps into the picture and lives among the people that he himself painted. And the people in the picture didn't recognize him as the artist who painted the picture, and they pushed him away. They rejected the artist. They rejected the one who created it all. And that's a powerful picture that John's writing here. He came to interact with people and to love them. And they didn't get it, and they pushed him out. Jesus is trying to describe the conflict that he senses. John is trying to describe this conflict that he senses between how Jesus came to the earth and how he loved people and why people pushed him out. Look, Jesus came to the earth to love people, and they pushed him out. What went wrong? I mean, can you not back away and say, look at that and say, what went wrong with this? What exactly didn't work out? Because look, we're talking about God who created the earth, the heavens and the earth. We're talking about Jesus, the Son of God, coming to the earth. Had they not figured out how people work yet? I mean, doesn't it raise some questions? I realize if you've been raised in church, you've read this over and over again, that it's easy for you. But if you're hearing this for the first time, this message, why didn't God get this right? Where's the tension? What happened? And John is trying to explain what happened here. Then in the opening section of that piece of literature, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that section, he gives us this terminology. He gives us the words that best describe this tension. That if you're a follower of Jesus, you're going to bump up into it at some time in your life. What John's going to describe here, you're going to experience it as a follower of Christ. If you're really following him, you're going to experience the same tension that John writes about that Jesus experienced and all of his followers did. If you're a follower of Christ, it's going to be messy at times when you're trying to love people and speak into people's lives. That's what we do as Christians. We risk people not liking us to love them enough to tell them the truth. But sometimes people are so badly behaved and we are not to tell them anything in that moment. We're to love them through that. What is that? And when do you do what? And why do you love people through it sometimes, and you know their just behavior's terrible, they need to be corrected, and sometimes you call people out? What's the difference, and where's this tension come from? I mentioned this is one of the harder messages to get a hold of, and I want you to stay with me. Here are the words John left us with. This is in John 1, verse 14. He said this, "The Word," that's Jesus, "the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." There's this imagery there that Jesus camps out with us. He comes and stays with us and lives with us and eats with us. Then he goes on to write, "We," meaning he's talking about he and his buds, the guys who witnessed this. Right? "We have seen," I've seen something you haven't seen, and you have to see it to understand it, and I was there, John's saying. "We have seen his glory. The glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father." And then he gives us his very powerful and descriptive words. Listen, he comes from the Father full of grace and truth. And there's the tension. He comes full of grace and truth. Now, you know what grace is, right? I mean, I was in Bible college, and he defined it as the unmerited or undeserved favor of God. That's the way I learned it in Bible college. It's the undeserved, unmerited favor of God. That's grace. It's the blessings of God. Grace. Say it with me. Blessings of God. Good. Truth. Well, we know what truth is. That's the opposite, of what we were tempted to do as little children. I was in a store up the road from our house. It was called the Country Store. It was in Salerno. It's not there anymore. It's like wasn't it a log kind of cabin thing, Mom? I think it was. No. Anyways, it was a big old wooden building. It's on the corner of Dixie Highway and St. Lucie Boulevard there. And I went to that place, and I don't know how old I was, but I was with one of my sisters, I think, older, probably Sandy. And I remember picking up something that looked cool. It was a little figure of a gun, but it was in wax. And it had liquid in it. Remember when they sold, we bought that stuff. What were we thinking? Do you bet that teenagers today is like, you bought that? You seriously bought that stuff? You'd bite the end off the wax. If you were hungry, you'd chew the wax. I don't even know what that was about. But you'd drink the juice out of it. And if you were one of those kids who didn't get it through all, you would chew it to try to get the rest of the flavor out of the wax. And I remember picking one of those things up, and I looked around. I couldn't have been over 5 years old. I looked around, and I put it in my pocket. And I knew in that moment that I was taking something that I didn't pay for. And I didn't have any money to pay for it. I was 5. And as I'm walking out the door, evidently the lady stopped whoever was with me, probably Sandy. And the lady saw me. You're 5, you're not that aware of your surroundings, And she told on me, this lady. And my sister asked me, did you take something? And I said, no. I knew what the truth was at 5 years old. I just chose not to use it. And she said, this lady said, you have something in your pocket. No, I don't. And I learned years ago, as a child, a good liar, he goes to his grave with his lies. And no. Well, empty your pockets. Okay. And I'm thinking, how can I empty my pockets and keep this thing stuck in there? How can I do that? How can I put it in and I got caught. And we put it back. I'd like to say that's the last time I tried to take something. I just got better at it is what I did. And I never actually got caught stealing anything after that. But it wasn't until I came to Christ and I had stole many things, mostly money out of my parents' wallets. Never over $1 or $5, never a $5. Because my dad would miss $5 bills, but he would miss ones and quarters. I knew what the truth was. We know what the truth is, according to us. We know what grace is. You know what truth is? Truth says you're accountable. I was accountable to open my pockets. I was accountable. I couldn't lie and get away with it as a 5-year-old. I was accountable. Truth says you're accountable. Grace says, you're forgiven. Truth says you're in trouble for what you did. Grace says, you're fine. You're forgiven. Truth says, no, you're broken. Grace says, no, you'll be okay. Truth says, no, you're going to have to work on it. Grace says, no matter what you do, I love you. Truth says, no, you're still accountable. You see the difference? Grace is this mercy, this unending mercy. And we read about the mercy of God, the grace of God, and it is just that. It is unending. We're going to read it in a minute. It says grace upon grace upon grace. It means a compiled grace. There's no end to his grace. But yet there's no end to his truth. And there is the tension, and there is the conflict, and how do we resolve that? And we all want to kind of lean one way or the other. I personally was raised in a church where we were about the truth. And the pastor would say, the truth. He would get really high when he said, the truth, you know. And we knew the truth. We could preach the truth. I went to a Bible college where they taught the truth. We were all about truth. We weren't so good on grace. So I could stand, it's my natural tendency to be harsh and to hold you to a standard. Because if you don't, I heard a preacher say one, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. He was a fundamental Baptist preacher, and I didn't know what that meant. But what he meant was, you have to hold everybody to the standard. The problem was, nobody could reach this standard. This was the law. He preached the law. And who can follow all the law? Jesus even said to a group of guys in a few minutes, we'll read, who's without sin in this group here? We tend to lean one way or the other. You've been brought up by parents. How many of you have parents? Can I see your hands? Thank you very much. People sleeping, or they don't get this part of the message. Your parents were either one way or the other. I mean, you had a grace parent, and you had a graceless parent, maybe. You had a parent who was gracie, and you had truthy. And how many of you liked Gracie the best? Yes. Because Gracie was like, oh, well, don't make a big deal of that. Let it go. But the truth was like, no, he's got to do. And you would think that in the family, we've got 4 children, you would think that you're always one way or the other. But there are times my wife was the gracious, and I was no, he's got to, The first time I tried to make my son Canaan eat all the broccoli, and I'm not kidding, this sounds like a textbook problem, but he would not eat the broccoli. And this is a bad moment. It was his birthday. It was his probably 4th, I don't know. But it was broccoli. And if he doesn't eat it, his hair will fall out or something because he's not going to be healthy. And I'm the dad. And he's not eating the broccoli. And I just try to be so gentle. Canaan, buddy, he's 4, he's 5. I think it's his 5th birthday. He's blind. He's as cute as he can be. You got to eat the broccoli, buddy, because we're going to have your cake in a few minutes. And he's like, I don't want to eat. No, you got it, son. You got to eat the broccoli. But Daddy, I don't think I can eat the broccoli. Son, this is horrible. You're going to have to sit there, buddy, until you eat that broccoli. We'll wait on you. We're not in a hurry. We love you, but, if we didn't love you, we wouldn't make you eat the broccoli, but we love you. And after 15 or 20 minutes, this beautiful little boy takes a stalk of broccoli, puts it in his mouth, and starts chewing. And what followed was like The Exorcist. This little boy looked at me, looked at his mom, he's holding his mouth shut, and we don't know what's about to come, but I mean, he experienced projectile vomiting. It shot out about 2 feet ahead of him, and all the food he had eaten, and I was horrified. It's his birthday, and I'm watching this horrible moment. And the kids don't do that without crying. So now he's crying, and there's a mess. And in my mind, I thought, I will never, ever, ever make my kids eat broccoli again. It's the broccoli that's the problem. I was the truth guy. Natalie was, honey, do you really think it's that big a deal? I learned something that day. Broccoli's not worth it. We worked very hard to make sure the rest of his day was a great day. But it was a horrible, horrible moment. Other times, and my wife would testify to this, and so would my kids, other times my wife is the truth soldier, and I'm the gracious guy. And they'll choose me in that moment. It just depends on what the situation is and what our experience is. Oh, that's no big deal. Let it go. Listen folks, we're all bent this direction. Most of us like truth. But we don't want it when it costs us anything. We really like grace all the time. Grace is just good. And here's what John said. He said that this is so remarkable. He said this. He said, I spent years watching Jesus, and as I begin my description of Jesus, here's what I saw. He said Jesus was absolutely full. Watch this. He was absolutely full of truth. And he was absolutely full of grace. Full, and how can you be full of these two things? Isn't it a mix? Isn't it a mix? We think it's a mix. 50-50, but no. John says no, he was full. This is the way John described this as he looked at how Jesus treated people. And John sees this word and he has to stop and reflect. How can I put this into words so that it's understandable? He is the full measure of truth, and he's a full measure of grace. And that's what he is. And there's the tension. And if we try to be one or the other all the time, we will not represent Christ very well. We won't. We may represent religion well, or preachers well, or church well. We will not represent Christ well, because there's a time to say that is wrong. Even get your voice up and get serious about it. That's wrong. And there's a time to say, God loves you. You keep at it. God loves you. Don't give up. And if you miss that timing, and I've missed that timing in the past, you tend to push people away that should have been drawn in. And some people, if you miss the timing, they should have been set straight and they just were given an easy road. And how do you know when to do what? I like truth when I'm telling people what's wrong with them. I counsel people a lot. And I like truth when I'm telling people what they need to fix. But I'm kind of a grace guy if somebody's talking to me and correcting me. I'm kind of a grace guy. Give me grace. But John said, I watched Jesus, and the best way to describe it, he was to the brim full of grace and truth. And then John said this in John 1:16. Listen what he said. He said, out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given, which literally means, and some translations say it just like this, we've received grace upon grace upon grace, and it could just keep going. Great. We've just received more and more and more and more. How many of you feel like that's you? Grace upon grace upon grace. And when is God going to say, I am done with you? And he hasn't said that. He never says it. There are times we say, I'm done with you, God, and we walk away. He has never said that. As long as we're willing to come back, he's willing to receive us back. That's the amazing thing about Jesus Christ, this message of Christ. And then if that wasn't clear enough, just to be clear, here's what he says in John 1:17. John 1:17, he says, for the law was given. That word given is important. He came down off the mountain. He had the 10 Commandments. He gave it. God gave them to him. He gave them to the people. For the law was given through Moses. Listen next. Grace and truth came. That word came is so important. That word came is actually translated begotten. It came. It wasn't given. He came. He brought it with him. It was in him. It was him. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. It wasn't the balance between. It was a full measure of grace and truth. And this is what made Jesus and his life and how we love people so messy and so confusing to people. This is why some of you are going, I'm not sure where this is going because I'm not really sure what he's trying to say. But keep listening because you're going to get it towards the end. This is what made him so unpredictable because we want it to be one way or the other, all truth or all grace. It's hard to know when to mix the two. And John said Jesus was all of it. He was grace and he was truth. And he brought all of it to bear on every individual he ever spoke to, or touched, or walked with, or prayed for, or forgave, or healed. Always. He was a perfect fullness of grace and truth. And then one day, you see that, if you understand that Jesus is this mix, but a complete fullness of grace and truth. If you look at all that he did through that lens, you'll begin to see it clearly. You'll understand it. We see it when he talked to this woman. We know the story is the woman at the well, right? He sees this woman at the well. He walks up. He sits down with her, and she's sitting there, and he spoke to her. You know what that was? Him speaking to her? It was grace. Because that was not in his culture. That's something you didn't do. I know it sounds mean in our culture, but if you were a Jewish person, you did not talk to a Samaritan woman at all. You didn't talk to a Samaritan, much less a woman. It just wasn't done. And Jesus comes up and he engages her in conversation, and there's grace immediately. He leads with love. We've often said we are to lead with love. And then he engages in conversation. Hey, can you get me some water? It's going along so swimmingly well. And then he just brings something up and throws a big mess in the middle of this conversation. He says, hey, listen, enjoyed talking with you. I want you to go back to your home, Sychar, where you live. I want you to go and bring back your husband. And she says, I don't have a husband. He said, I know. He said, you've been married 5 times, and the man you're with now is not your husband. It was going so well. It was so gracious. Why did Jesus suddenly, he exposed the shame of this lady. She's not proud of this. Even in the Samaritan culture, to be remarried, that's just not acceptable. In that culture, it was like, really, what's your problem? This lady couldn't deal with life. She couldn't deal with men, that was for sure. And now Jesus, so gracious, is to sit and talk with her. And now he goes right to the great source of her pain and shame. Who does that? And why? Then Jesus reveals to this woman, in the middle of it all, after he proclaims what is true. We would call it a prophetic word. Jesus had never met her before and tells her about her. And instead of feeling condemned, which she did not, he revealed something nobody else knew. Well, nobody he knew. He revealed something he never should have known and didn't have any way to know. And she was so moved by that. He goes and speaks into her life. And he says to her, listen, by the way, guess who I am? He reveals to her something. He said it in such a way he never said it to anybody else in the New Testament. Guess who I am? I'm the Messiah. The way he said it to her. And he said, I can give you water that will quench the greatest thirst of your soul. I can give you water that will quench your thirst and that no man can ever quench. And she's so moved, she doesn't feel condemned. She goes back into her city and she tells everybody who will listen, everybody about this man that's the Messiah. I met the Messiah. I met the Jewish Messiah. There's grace and there's truth. Remember back when we talked a couple weeks ago about Matthew, when Jesus was calling his disciples out, and he was calling them out, and he got them all together, and he had Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and all these guys, and then he said to them, hey guys, listen, we're going to go to Matthew's house tonight. And they're like, now listen, Matthew was a tax collector, right? And we know what that means. But I don't think we fully know what it means. When the Bible's describing like bad people, it describes like thieves and liars and tax collectors. It doesn't just say evil people. It says sinners and tax collectors. They had their own category. They were so bad. They were so badly thought of in the culture because they were Jewish people that for the Roman Empire literally took money from their own people so that they could benefit themselves. They gave the money and took extra money to please themselves. And everybody hated. And I don't know how you feel about tax collectors today. It's not exactly a good feeling that comes up in you when you think of tax collectors. But at that time, they had their own category of evil people. And Matthew was a tax collector. And Jesus selects him. Jesus says, come follow me. And Matthew follows him. Then Jesus turns around to John and Luke and Peter and says, hey, listen, we're going to go to Matthew's house tonight. Wait, Jesus. Jesus, listen, let's be reasonable. We have a reputation. And you're about to mess this whole thing up. Jesus, you probably don't know this because he's a tax collector. And if we go to his house, we're going to be associated, we're going to be associated with the tax collector. Jesus, they're evil. They throw big parties and bad things happen and drinking and it's bad. And you can't go. We're not going. Jesus said, oh yeah, we're going. And it gets worse. We're staying for the party. We're going. You're going to have to interact with these people. Jesus knew that Matthew was a messed up sinner. He knew what he did. And he was going to go to his house and sit down and have a meal with him and let the party happen and bring his other guys in. Grace. Grace. Why didn't Jesus call Matthew out? Matthew, you know what you are. We know what you are. You know, he didn't do that. But isn't that kind of what we would want to do? Peter, you got some issues, but you've never collected taxes. So you come on. Matthew, no. Grace. Grace. Then we see Jesus hanging on a cross between two thieves. And look at this story. Now, the word thieves doesn't accurately connect with us what these guys were. If you were a thief in the Roman culture, you could actually be chained to a ship and you could row, be in a galley, you could row the ship. There were lots of stuff they could do with thieves to get them off the streets. You could imprison them. You could make them work for the empire. Those who found their way to the Roman cross, they were the dredge of the earth. They were the worst. They were the incorrigibles. They were those that were just unfixable. If you put them in a place where they were going to work with other people, they would mess that up. They were just bad blood. And Jesus is on a cross between these two people. And one of them is spitting and cursing at Jesus, mocking him. Oh, if you're the Son of God, get yourself off the cross. The other one looks over and reprimands him. Hey, shut up. It doesn't say it like that, but shut up. Easily. That's probably what it meant. And then this one guy, the criminal, all he does is look over to Jesus and he makes this, listen, it's an outrageous request. What this criminal, murderer, horrible person, incorrigible person does, he looks over, he has the audacity now to look over to Jesus and say, Lord, that alone, that one moment, Lord, said volumes to Jesus, evidently. Lord, would you remember me when you come into your kingdom? And don't we expect Jesus, if you're reading it for the first time, to look over and say, you know what, you seem like a nice guy for a minute, but you've had a life of sin and you're about to pay for it. All right? But he looks over and says, today, when you wake up, you and me. We're going to be together in heaven. You and me. Today. Where's the justice in that, folks? You understand what I'm saying? Now, go back just a couple of chapters and you see Jesus meets a guy that comes up to Jesus. He's called the rich young ruler. Remember this guy? He comes up to Jesus. I picture it on a horse. I don't know why. He comes up on a nice horse, all decorated out, because he's a rich young ruler. And he comes up to Jesus. He's like, Jesus, hey, what do I have to do to inherit the kingdom of heaven? Hey, he's pursuing Jesus, right? Come on. He's pursuing him. He's not a criminal on a cross. He's a rich young ruler, and he's looking for salvation. Right? Doesn't that just qualified? It's all wow. Come on. And what did Jesus say to him? Right? Did he say, I am impressed with you, dude. Come on. Fine. But Jesus said, okay, here's what you do. Sell everything you have. Give it to the poor. Leave everything you have and come and follow me. And the text insinuates, keep following me. Give your stuff away, all your, and come follow me. Where is the justice in this? Why did Jesus forgive a guy who's a horrible man on a cross because he's called him Lord and asked him if he would, and not easily forgive a guy who came pursuing him? It's the tension, folks. It's the unpredictable nature of grace and truth together. And there's the most famous story of all, and you'll recognize this one. It's the one that a lot of people talk about, and I've mentioned it a lot, because it's just heart-wrenching for me, this moment where this woman who clearly now, just back up. How many prostitutes out there today do you think just woke up when they were a child and said, I think I really want to be a prostitute when I get older? How many young ladies you think in their teenage years decided, this is what I think I want to do? That's not what happens. Difficulties happen, hardships happen, abuse happens, And young ladies become accustomed to being used and abused. And they go into that lifestyle because they're torn and they're broken, right? We know this to be fact. You go interview almost any woman on the streets and you ask her story, and it is a heart-wrenching story. And we've had stories up on this screen just like that. And this this prostitute is thrown down at the feet of Jesus by these religious men, these great Pharisaical religious men. And they throw this woman down at the feet of Jesus. And they say, Lord, she's been caught in adultery. The law says we should stone her. What do you say? And again, if you know the story, these guys were always trying to trip Jesus up. They're trying to get Jesus in trouble by him saying the wrong thing. And Jesus could have easily said, that's great, but that's the law, the Jewish law. That's not Roman law. You can't stone her without the approval of a judge. So good luck with that, guys. Jesus could have said that. I mean, if you really study the times, Jesus easily could have said that. And they would have gone, that's right. Didn't think of that. But Jesus played that game. And he said, you know what? You're right. The law says stone her. So tell you what. Any one of you who have never lusted after a woman, you throw the stone. Any one of you who have never lied, never cheated on your taxes, never hated anyone, you throw the first stone. Anyone who's never sinned, anyone who's without sin, you throw the first stone. And they dropped their rocks and they left. And then Jesus, this is where the grace and the mercy come in. Jesus looks to her and he says, where are you? Where are those who accuse you? And she says, they're gone. He says, I don't condemn you. I don't condemn you either. Grace, right? I don't condemn you. Then he says, now go and stop sinning. Stop living the life of sin you've been living. There's truth. Grace, I don't condemn you either. Sinner, stop your sinning. Stop doing what you're doing. You recognize in that sentence, it was good for a moment. If you're heavy on grace, it was good for a moment. I don't condemn you. Yay! But you're a sinner. Stop your sinning. But yet Jesus struck that perfect measure, that perfect chord that was a combination of grace and truth. You're a sinner. I don't condemn you. Did you have to bring up the sin part? Couldn't you just left it alone? Yeah, he had to bring up the sin part. Because this is how I love. This is how I love people. And I am the embodiment, Jesus says, of grace and truth. We as a church are the embodiment of patience and kindness and generosity. And when we're bothered, it may be that grace just needs to come in and let the moment go. Because often our flesh is bothered and it has nothing to do with God or Christ in us, right? You're with me? As a church, we try so hard to get this right. People walk in that door and they'll continue to walk in that door. And as we move to the new building in 6 months or so, they'll walk in that door. And we don't know their stories. We don't know where they've been. We don't know if they're involved right now in the gay community and that's who they define themselves as. But that they come in that door, I believe it's because God brought them in that door. And we don't know what kind of laws they've broken or what kind of life they've lived. And I think if we all stood up and told their stories, we would be shocked to hear some of the stories in this room. But what I do know about this church is that we wouldn't separate off into sinners and non-sinners. I believe there would be a great unity of love because we've all been forgiven of sins. We've all been, and every one of us know this. Given the right circumstances, we too could be absolutely in the gutter. Given the right circumstances, we too could be at the very bottom trying to claw our way up. And when somebody reaches down and hands you grace and brings you up, that's really what we've all been given. That's who we are. If you want to know what Jesus said, what Jesus meant by what Jesus said, we said before, watch what Jesus did. If you want to know what Jesus meant when he said, love one another, then you watch how Jesus loved. And you know how he loved? You know how Jesus loved? He called sin, sin, and then he paid for it. And having paid for it, he declared, I don't condemn you. And then he says to all of us, now that I have called sin, sin, paid for it, and said I don't condemn you, I want all of you to leave your life of sin. And if you don't, I love you. And if you can't, I love you. And if the woundedness and shrapnel of your own sin has left you in a place where you're not even sure you'll be able to walk away from how complex, the complexity of your own sin, the confusion of your own sin, I love you. And if someone has sinned against you, and it has sent you into a spiral of self-destructive behavior, and you're not even sure if you can ever recover from it, I love you. And the truth is, you're a sinner. But the grace is, I don't condemn you. And no one will ever love you more than I do. And I couldn't love you any more than I do now, Jesus says. But there's this tension. And it's a tension that if you ever try to resolve it yourself or figure it out or get it perfect, you're going to miss something. You want to know why we can't let go of truth as followers of Christ, and Jesus himself couldn't let go of truth? The reason that we keep saying what we say, the reason Jesus kept holding people accountable to sin, is because sin is not innocuous. Sin is not some small little ingredient in what sin has. It's got a gotcha. It's got a consequence. There's a gotcha to sin. And God doesn't want us to have to suffer. See, that's the thing. God doesn't want us to have to suffer the gotcha of sin, the entanglement of sin, the consequences of sin. He loves us as much. And listen, if you've been living long, you know, I don't know about all of you here in this room, but I'll say this to you. I know what sin is all about. I know the addicting nature of sin. I know the entanglement of sin. How it feels like when I was a kid, we watched a show called Sea Hunt. Anybody remember Sea Hunt? You have to be really old. You shouldn't even raise your hand. What are you thinking? You got to be 50-year-old to Sea Hunt. And this man would go scuba diving, and he would get in them, and every now and then, if you weren't careful, you would get in the kelp. And he would somehow find his way into wrestling matches underwater in this kelp. Did you ever notice how that happened with Sea Hunt? And the guys that weren't used to the kelp would get all tangled in it, and they would drown. And the Sea Hunt guy, it was Bridges. Lloyd Bridges, which is Bro Bridges, and the other Bridges' dad. Acting, yeah? And sin is like that kelp. It has this entangling effect that you find yourself drowning. And you couldn't get away from it. And you're drowning in the very thing that you thought would be fun. And you're drowning in the very thing you thought would be freedom. And you're drowning in the very thing you thought would be fulfilling. And it's killing you. And that's the nature of sin. And God loves us so much, he doesn't want you to be tangled in that. So he gives you truth. He gives you truth. He gives you truth. He gives you grace to receive the truth. Then the rest is up to you. This is why God gave us a free will. We choose. God doesn't choose. We choose. The church, us, is at its best when we embrace both grace and truth, and we refuse to let go of either. When a church gets wrapped up in one or the other, we're a grace church. Come in the door, everything goes. That's a church that is devoid of truth, and you find people just as lost in that church as they were before they ever walked in the door. You walk in a church that has just truth. That sounds better, doesn't it? If you're going to have anything, have truth. But it's just as sick and sad and out of balance because people coming off the streets, they find no grace. They find no warm, welcoming hand. They just find a hard wall of truth. And without both of them, the work of Christ is not going to happen on the earth. And listen, this is what God calls us to, church. This is what we're to be. And we need a massive dose of truth in our world. We need massive doses of grace in our world. And how do we get it? And I'm going to pick up on that next week. I'm going to really go into how can you know how to treat this and this. When is grace? When is truth? When is it accommodate? When is it? How do we know that? How do we discern that? Because I believe there's a very, very clear answer. And I'll give you a little hint. If you do not allow God to speak through you, and you may think, that sounds really hard. Doesn't that take like a seminary degree? Don't you have to go to school a long time for God to do that? No. A little child can allow God to speak through him. A little humble spirit. We're going to pick up on the next week and really unfold it. What does it look like to do what Christ called us to do on the earth? How do we do it? How do we do it for morning, noon, and night? The band's going to come up today, and they're going to play a song. And if you would like somebody to pray for you, we want to do that. If you're sitting out there today and you do not know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, I mean, you've just never really connected with God and you don't know what that's about, I'm going to ask you just to keep on coming. I'm going to ask you today, if you're ready to pray to God and say, God, right now, I'm going to make this verbal proclamation. I want to follow Christ. I want to know you. We're going to invite you to do that today. You can do that seated where you're at. You can do that coming down here. You can do that tonight kneeling by your bed. But I invite you to follow Christ. Come and follow me, Jesus said. And Jesus didn't give qualifiers. Come and follow me if you dress a certain way. Come and follow me if you live in a certain neighborhood. Come and follow me if you know how to speak well. He just said, come and follow me. And he called fishermen, and he called tax collectors, and he called lawyers, and he called them all to come and follow him. And he's calling today, come and follow me. It doesn't mean you know where you're going. It means he does, and you're going to trust him today. So if you'd stand, in just a few minutes, we'll close this service.
You stood before